I'm starting just to make sure, but I'll edit out this awkward part right here.
Okay.
And Jen, will you hold up your board just so I can make sure that that's going to... Yes, if you do it there, it's right in the middle.
Okay, cool. Great.
Okay, Jen, well, we're coming to you because you're an expert on the economic basis for policy analysis and some of the economic principles. So I'm just hoping you can talk a little bit about thinking behind what the perfect market is and the Pareto effect and the idea within there that everyone's better and no one's worse.
Sure. So, much of orthodox economics or neoclassical economics today relies on a couple of the basic assumptions about markets. And I think the easiest way to characterize those assumptions are to understand that they characterize markets as being predominantly composed of several things. Perfect competition over price between producers of goods. Perfect information between purchasers of goods and suppliers of goods. And stable preferences on the part of people. We know that those hard assumptions don't actually hold in real life for the vast majority of goods and services, but it's still a nice construct to work with to understand prices and why prices are what they are and kind of how prices exist in potentially equilibrium between demand and supply. And those principles have been really lasting principles in economics. One thing that depiction of the market also assumes, though, is this notion of Pareto efficiency. Pareto was actually a researcher, a man, Vilfredo Pareto, a couple hundred years ago, who was researching the relationship between average income and the development over time in nation states, and the distribution of wealth in nation states. So I think Pigot, who is known as like one of the historians of welfare economics, one of the early thinkers in welfare economics, went and studied what Vilfredo Pareto had done, and he realized that even though we call Pareto's assumptions Pareto's law, that Pareto himself didn't think that there should be a law. What Vilfredo Pareto had found was that at least in one nation that he had studied, that as income grew on average, so income tended toward the mean for individuals. So in a sense, the rising tide floated all boats. So as one person's wealth accrued, so did other people's wealth accrue. This is the general sense of Pareto's law today, as neoclassical economists use it. But if you think about it, it's entirely possible in real life for one person's wealth to accrue and for other people's wealth to stay the same and to have a growing gap in inequality and wealth. So it's important for people to know, if they're studying economics and the economic effects of policy, that Pareto's law is not actually a law, it's an assumption. And it's an assumption that requires you, if you're using kind of a neoclassical thinking about the marketplace, and studying price, it requires you to realize that you're not actually examining the distribution of wealth. You're assuming the distribution of wealth. So if you want to know what's happening to income inequality, you have to study explicitly income inequality. If you want to know what's happening to the poor and whether or not they're getting wealthier or poorer relative to other people, you actually have to study that explicitly. Like, studies of price and the distribution of goods and services and demand and supply won't give you answers to those questions.
That's
Yeah.
great. Well, so talk more about other challenges in understanding the market and reasons to conduct good policy analysis. Talk about market failures.
So, as you can imagine, right, with Pareto inefficiencies, there, as with Pareto inefficiencies, as with any of these assumptions of perfect competition, for instance, there are many ways in which markets can fail. They can fail to exhibit those qualities that neoclassical models attach to them. We can have less than perfect competition. Sometimes economists call it imperfect competition. Sometimes you can have situations of monopoly. But there are many ways in which markets can fail. And in general, public goods theory is a body of economic theory that attempts to express the nature of market failures and ascribe to market failures the need for policy interventions in the marketplace. So market failures become policy rationales for government intervention in the marketplace. I'll see if I can characterize just a few of them, right? So if you have a monopoly, economists like to talk about monopoly in terms of market for a particular good and one provider that's dominating the market, 90% or more of the market for providing a particular good or service. But I think, especially in infrastructure, it's much easier for students to conceptualize monopoly provision of good or service, because it actually is quite prevalent in infrastructure markets. In terms of the consumer's position, because ultimately, if you are being provided a service by a monopoly, when you have only one choice of provider to go to for that good or service, and there's really no adequate substitute in the marketplace, no reasonable substitute that you can access. So, for instance, when we buy our homes, we are generally buying our homes plus monopoly provision of water service, monopoly provision of electrical service, because we aren't likely to have those services duplicated with more than one electrical service to our house, more than one water provider giving us pipe to our house. And so there are actually many forms of infrastructure that most people experience in the monopoly provision of services. Now, when services are provided by monopolies, the monopoly, or the organization providing the service, in many ways is free to set price, and the consumer is likely to have to take the price that is set by the monopoly provider. There is no competition per se. So without competition to cause the provider to compete for price and compete for customers, they can set the price where they want. The price that's set, the degree to which the price is set above the cost of producing the service is what people refer to as monopoly rent or rent. And rent-seeking behavior is the behavior of the producer to seek some extra profit, to seek profit above and beyond the cost of production. Too much rent-seeking behavior from monopoly providers is a drag on the economy. I mean, it's just extra money in the pockets of people who provide monopoly services. So historically, in the United States and across the world, there have been several different sort of distributions of public and private responsibility, or public regulators over private provision. Lots of different institutional models that have been tried, sometimes retried and retried and retried, to try to reduce this drag on the economy and reduce the effect of rent-seeking behavior. That is just one example of market failure, and there are many, many others, but yeah, there's one.
It's an important one. And you already started talking about rent-seeking behavior, which was another question I had.
Oh, cool.
Tell me about public goods, especially rivalrous and non-rivalrous, and maybe you can give a couple examples.
Sure. So like in your students' reading for this week, there was a nice table that kind of laid out the notion that you can have goods that are rivalrous, non-rivalrous, excludable, non-excludable. Public goods theory came about because Paul Samuelson and a couple of other prominent economists, Mancur Olson, started thinking about, instead of about price, they started to think about the nature of goods. They started to ask questions like about if I consume this good, can you also consume the same good? And if you also consume this good, does your consumption impinge on my ability to consume it? If I think about most goods that fit kind of a neoclassical market conception, like a can of soup on the grocery store shelf, that is a rivalrous good that we would think of in a private marketplace, because if I consume it, you can't. If you consume it, I can't. But the reason why Samuelson started to think of alternative conceptions was because he looked around and said, well, if you drive on the street, I can also drive on the street. There's water in watersheds, and to some degree I can use it and you can too. So maybe there are characteristics, there are goods that have characteristics of non-rivalrousness. Like we can both consume it together and actually both gain equal or even greater benefit as we're consuming them together. Some infrastructure goods and services have this characteristic of non-rivalrousness up to a point of so many people consuming that you've reached the capacity of the good. So we can all enter the freeway, but if too many of us enter the freeway, we get congestion to the point where one additional car can't enter. So then we've gone from having a non-rivalrous good to having a rivalrous good. So it's kind of a gradual process. You can think of, golf courses and swimming pools. You can think of a lot of different types, parks, right? A lot of different types of goods that we provide in infrastructure services that have these characteristics. Excludability is even easier to conceive of, because it's just about, can we exclude people from consuming the good or not? So can you put a fence around it? And if you can put a fence around it, if you can exclude people from entering or using or consuming the good, you can also charge for the use of the good. So those are kind of the basic conceptions. And in your table, in your reading, you've got yes or no and yes or no about rivalrousness and excludability. right? So like your basic setup, is this good? Can you exclude people from using it? Yes. Is it rivalrous? Yes. So those are generally good, private commodities. So, right?
Mm-hmm.
And pure public commodities are conceived of as goods that you can't exclude people from consuming, and people's consumption doesn't impede other people's enjoyment of the goods. So those are thought of as your pure public goods. And you can imagine that there are categories of goods for which you might have non-excludability but rivalrousness. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Generally, those are described by the tragedy of the commons.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So think of the classic case in Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons of common pastures where sheep are grazing or cattle are grazing, right? If everyone is sending their sheep in and there's a limited resource, a rivalrous resource, right? But you can't exclude people from using it, you could very well experience a race to the bottom. Okay? People using it up to get the most use out of it before it's all gone. We experience that, for instance, in our groundwater aquifer use.
Mm-hmm.
Really hard to deal with. Then, on the other hand, you could have goods that you can exclude people from using. So you could charge for their use, but they're not necessarily rivalrous goods, and those are generally thought of as club goods. So think about, your golf course or your various clubs. So you pay an entrance. You can be charged a fee to enter and join the club, but your enjoyment of that, it doesn't impinge on other people's enjoyments until congestion becomes really high.
I'd say maybe like $5.20 with having to pay to go across the bridge.
Oh yeah, easily. Like, so you can imagine various parts of our transportation system could fit in any one of these boxes, right? So if let's see, your local neighborhood street. So chances are it probably won't experience congestion to the point where it would be rivalrous, because you just don't
Parking
have
sometimes, depending on the neighborhood.
Yeah, parking perhaps, right? But generally passage through it, we aren't all going to go get into all those vehicles and usually try to exit all at the same time and experience that kind of congestion. And so they're usually pretty non-rivalrous, right?
Mm-hmm.
Get my colors out. So you can have neighborhood streets. You could go out into collector streets and get yourself onto a highway, and there could be a segment of highway that's tolled, like a bridge or something. Well, if you're tolling and you're not allowing access without payment of the toll, then you've created a club good. Let's see. So excludability and private was more like the vehicle you bought and owned to be able to travel on the highway in the first place. And there are also other types of private transportation systems that we can think of, privately owned rail services and this and that, right? You could also experience a tragedy of the commons in transportation. You think about the people who it wasn't always the case that our national park system charged an entrance fee. And they can't exactly put a fence around Yosemite. But people will come and enjoy, and in fact overflow through the park, doing more damage than they know. So you could end up experiencing a tragedy of the commons because of transportation through the park. So yeah, you can imagine, even in one sector of infrastructure, in experiencing any combination of these qualities.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, another question.
Yeah.
Let's talk about marginal social cost and private cost.
Oh gosh, yeah, marginal costs, private costs.
Although, you know what? Hold on, I'm going to back up. I'm realizing the future question probably relates to what you have on that board, so let's just go right into it. Tragedy of the Commons. Can you talk a little bit about free riders?
Oh yeah, sure, right.
And then we'll come back to the whole marginal social cost thing.
Right. So back to the situation of having rivalrous goods in the as in the tragedy of the commons. So, you know, your ability to consume is affected by my consumption, and non-excludability. So I can't do anything to keep you from consuming the good. So in those cases, how do you get, if you can't exclude people from consuming a good, how do you get them to pay for their consumption? The idea that someone can consume a good without paying is the idea that we could have free riders, people who are consuming without doing their fair share or paying their part. In a lot of ways, government intervention exists for the purpose of collecting the fair share of payment for goods and services. So a lot of government policy and infrastructure exists to collect taxes or some other form of payment in lieu of a user fee in order to cover the cost of a major good or service that we as a society recognize that we need. So you can think of sometimes really major infrastructure projects that that would not be in the interest of one particular firm to invest in, because it's not obvious to them how they would collect payment for ownership, or large infrastructure projects that we as a society would not want one monopoly firm to own and operate. These are the kinds of infrastructure projects that most often are carried out in public ownership and paid for through taxation. So you can think of, Seattle seawall in that context, and other sorts of major infrastructure that underpins, the functioning of not just our infrastructure systems, but our real estate markets on top of them. How odd would it be for a firm to try to collect money on the basis of having built and owned the seawall? And if they did, what would that do? It could create some real distortions for our markets in real estate and property in that area. It would be quite strange.
Thank you.
Sure.
So yes, now back to marginal social cost and private costs.
So I think of these concepts as really fairly simple. Marginal anything, marginal costs, marginal benefits, is incremental. So the cost of providing a good or a service to one more consumer, or the price that a consumer pays for one more increment of a good or service, is the marginal cost, is the marginal price. The incremental benefit that one more user or consumer receives when they consume the good is a marginal benefit. The social cost would be the cost experienced to society when the same activity is undertaken. So think about what we do as consumers. It's not always automatic or embedded in the price of a good. The benefits and the cost to society are not automatically embedded in the price of a good.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the easiest ways to conceive of social costs of market activity is through the concept of externalities. The most famous of all externalities is pollution. So we know that we can drive our cars around, and we're paying for what? We're paying for gas, we're paying for the car, we pay taxes that cover the costs to develop the roadways, but we're not paying in general yet in this country for the cost of the pollution to the air. And we might be paying a small slice of taxes that end up going to cover the cost of air pollution control districts to regulate the environment, but we're not actually paying a pollution tax or carbon tax or some other kind of measure like that. Yet society is experiencing the cost of the pollution. So the marginal private costs we experience are the things we actually pay for through the market. The marginal social costs are the things that society actually pays for because of that market activity. And again, all the terms, they can easily get, mashed up, right? And it can become hard to sort out and even harder to see in graphs. But if you can accept a concept like externalities, right, that there's an external effect from the transaction that takes place. We're acting in markets, we're buying things, we're selling things. When we do so, we're creating social impacts to third parties, impacts to society. Sometimes we're aware of them, sometimes we're not. If they're not embedded in the prices that we're paying, if they're not embedded in how the market's already behaving, then they're externalities and they're social costs.
It's pretty complicated.
Easily.
If you start thinking about full cost accounting.
Really complicated, really fast. So, usually people who study externalities explicitly and want to integrate those into costs or into prices or into policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
They usually begin by slicing out something in particular in the environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
We created, I think it was a market for sulfur dioxide or one of those air pollutants, and through policy making. And there have been talks about creating a market for carbon, and in some parts of the world there have been markets for carbon created. It might be hard for people to imagine, but markets exist on some level because they're spontaneous. People agree to trade, but markets also exist within the bounds set or because of policy creations. Without a market for sulfur dioxide, there'd be no market for sulfur dioxide. Without the creation of a policy creating a market for carbon, there would be no market for carbon. So this is true for a lot of externalities, where people will take some particular slice and try to work on accounting for the social costs of that particular externality. Sometimes they'll spend, their whole career just working on that particular problem. Sometimes we'll get lucky and the technological underpinnings of that externality are, the market will, once an institutional structure is imposed, the market will react and find a technological solution that's an easy economic substitute. So, like in terms of climate change, there's a list like the Montreal Treaty. I think it was like fluorocarbons, and people hail that as being a success story that suggests that we can actually go mitigate climate change because we were able to do it with the Montreal Treaty. We imposed a tax. We created a market for dealing with this externality, and then the firms that were generating were generating this chemical went and found a substitute that was not as damaging to the environment, and were able to put it in place. Sometimes policies are generated just to be able to nudge the market in this way. Yeah.
Great. I think I just have one final question, unless you have any missing comments. But you sort of already actually talked about some other characteristics of market failures, but maybe you can give a few more examples.
Well, another market failure
and maybe ties to policy as much as you can.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Another market failure that that students will, a lot of these concepts I'll bring up again in my infrastructure finance course. So this summer, when MIPM students come to that course, we'll end up going over these in depth. But another one I like to bring up is the notion of present value versus future value. One of the fundamental market failures that we experience, that we typically call intergenerational equity problems, is this idea that we value something more today than we ascribe value to it in the future. So if I could have $1 today, that's more valuable to me than saying I could have $1 tomorrow or $1 a year from now. Because of our sense that we value things more today and we discount that value in the future, we apply accounting principles for infrastructure projects that discount the value of what we invest in over the future. If you are creating really long-lasting infrastructure, the numerical value for your discount rate can actually end up becoming arbitrary and harmful to long-term decisions where you want to create something of lasting value for future generations. It's even more problematic if you want to invest in something that will have very little value today and have even more value for future generations, like wetlands or any kind of restoration that would take time to grow in value. Think about, the trees in riparian habitat along streams where endangered species of salmon would swim, right? They need the riparian habitat to give the riverbeds the temperature and qualities that they need for spawning. But it takes time for that habitat to grow. We invest now, could take 30 years for it to mature. We don't have a way of capturing that value in our, systems that we set up to account for, discount rates for infrastructure. And because we don't have a way to capture that value, on paper, decisions for gray infrastructure look a lot better than decisions for green infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And we end up perpetuating the same choices of intergenerational equity problems over and over again. The same problems occur in problems of discounting and discount rates being applied to infrastructure. When we have to make a choice to invest or not invest, or reinvest or not in infrastructure that may or may not last through the next environmental disaster. So in a way, just sort of the reapplication of the same cost-benefit models with the same discount rates have given us, Army Corps of Engineers decisions over and over again to reinvest in the same level of levee protection in New Orleans that was destroyed in Katrina. If we keep using the same economic models of present value and future value, we won't end up shifting the choices that we make, for a more sustainable future. Those kinds of problems will definitely, come more to the fore in the infrastructure and climate change course in the spring, and then get reiterated through discussions of discount rates and present value in my class in infrastructure finance in the summer.
They should look forward to it.
It sounds really geeky and full of numbers and just, oh my gosh, how am I going to do it? But it's, honestly, we just demystify it. It's not that difficult.
Are there any promising economic models or approaches to policy that you think deal with some of these problems?
Yeah, yes, there definitely are. And surprisingly enough, many of the solutions that look most promising come from planning. In planning, quite unlike engineering, quite unlike a large proportion of public policy schools, right? We have become really comfortable. We have to become really comfortable with uncertainty. We in planning recognize flat out that every one of these choices is a moral choice. That there are always winners and losers in the decision of urban development. So, and there are a lot of possible trajectories when you start to plan for the long-term future, which is really what we spend most of our time thinking about. So in these models with large degrees of uncertainty, we created alternative ways of visualizing futures, like scenario planning and robustness analysis, where you get a range of possible outcomes. And think about the range of possible outcomes that we see in graphs that are produced through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC reports. If someone tried to tell you that 50 years from now, the average annual temperature would be, 2.5 degrees Celsius greater than it is today, you would feel in your gut that we don't know, we don't have that level of accuracy. Well, a lot of times in engineering, that level of accuracy is demanded, and a lot of times in cost-benefit models, common to a lot of public policy analysis, that kind of level of accuracy is assumed or demanded. But in planning, we don't assume that level of accuracy to be available or useful. So we're okay with a range of alternatives. We're okay with empowering people to become part of the choice, recognizing that the world could end up more like this or more like this, and even being able to sort of share the information and thereby share risk. Right? So I think that's one of the reasons why planners emphasize public participation in decision making a lot. We emphasize transparency and accountability, which puts us together with schools of public policy. The more people know, the more they can be effective and empowered in making decisions for their long-term future. And that we can hope would be wiser decisions in the land of unknowns. So ultimately, even if the ground is shifting underneath us, like levels of precipitation, flooding, desertification, sea level rise, storm surge, with climate change, the assumptions that underlie our models are changing, and the levels of unpredictability are much greater than they used to be. So when you're faced with this, you still have to make a decision. And we still have annual budget cycles, and those resources are going to be allocated somewhere. Do we protect? Do we retreat? We're going to make a decision, so we have to base it on something, and maybe we shouldn't make it on the basis of, you know, the same old cost benefit models. Maybe we should be making it on using some other kind of metric, you know, maybe a multi-criteria analysis where lots of people are participating in the decision-making process and coming up with their own criteria of success. Well, that's used a lot in capital improvement programming, and it's you know, it's something that organizations worldwide, like the World Bank, is also working on, you know, coming up with other sorts of multi-criteria and robustness analysis that look at a range of options and scenarios for the future to try to determine what to do with our resources today in light of climate change. It's kind of a brave new world, and you know, not a bad one to be working with these planning principles. We all need to be a little more humble when we look into the future, but ultimately I think that's not a bad thing.
Well, thank you.